The way we plan to conduct the panel is that each of our panelists will have 5 minutes to express their particular point of view, or points of view, as the case may be, on their topic of interest. Because it's energy, you can imagine we will cover a wide range of topics. It's impossible to consider energy without discussing the extraordinary array on the supply side, also the extraordinary opportunities we may have on the demand side. There obviously is the environmental consideration of whatever form of energy we may be taking. Because we have everyone's biography well done in the book that you've received, it's not my intent to introduce the panel and repeat what's already printed. But we're going to go in the following order. Dan Esty will be first, and given his background with the transition team and the Obama administration, we'd like to put some of those views into the room, and Dan's own views as well. Next is Robert Currey. Robert is a commissioner in the state of New York. He is at what I call the coalface of energy. The coalface meaning not mining, but dealing with the consumer and rates and utilities. I can't think it.
Nothing more fun than that, really.
Right. They have such commonality of interest on a 24/7 basis.
One time a year, right.
Then we will move into material science, and Yuri Gogotsi will describe to us some of his views, particularly as we get into what matters with molecules. And then we will hear from David Moeller, who is a Chief Technology Officer at Duke Energy. I think you'll find this interesting. After each of the 5 minutes from each panelist, then we will offer the opportunity to both interact as a panel, because I suspect we may not all agree with one another. We will also want to interact with the audience. As I'm sure you see, the microphones are here. As you have a question, once we've each gone through the 5-minute presentations, feel free if you want to get right into it. This is my second time to moderate a panel on this subject. I know that it is a keenly felt and a much discussed subject throughout the nation, in the new administration, in the times that we are living. I come from an oil and gas background. Not my life, but my last 10 years. I have some particularly hard-held views on the whole range of energy, hard-held in the sense that I believe we need all forms of energy supply for the future, and do not at this stage of my thinking rule out the importance of hydrocarbons as part of our fuel future. There may be a time when we move beyond hydrocarbons. I'm not opposed to that. From 1998 onward, I was actively supporting wind, solar, hydrogen, and other sources of energy. So while I have an oil and gas background, I don't feel wedded to oil and gas. But in terms of the theme of today, as it relates to my own background, and a theme I've asked each of the panelists to consider in their remarks, is to consider the reality of what we face in energy versus the aspiration of what we could imagine in the future of energy. I think that's a point-counterpoint, reality versus aspiration. So let's see how it works in practice. Let's start with Dan.
John, thanks very much. Thank you all for braving the police cordons and other challenges of getting across New York to be here this afternoon. I do want to talk a little bit about the situation we're in and President Obama's view on it. And one reality is that we are in a very different place this year than we were a year or two ago. Notably, we have a president committed to really thinking about a new energy paradigm. And while it's an unfair caricature, one might argue that the major energy policy of the last decade centered on corn-based ethanol, which was hardly a strategy for really relaying a clean energy foundation for our society. So I think that is an important reality. We have a new president and a new commitment to action. A year ago, the U.S. was foot-dragging on climate change. Today, we haven't solved what we're going to do, but we have an administration that's engaged in the process. And I think it's important to note that the president's commitment on a clean energy future is very real and very strong. He has several other priorities ahead of energy and climate change on his docket. The economy every day is job one. National security is his job two. Right now, healthcare is number three, and he only has space for 3 items. So this means energy is not yet on front and center focus, but he does care. And I think he cares because he thinks there's a climate change issue to be addressed, but 3 other reasons to take up this issue that are in fact maybe more important. One is he strongly believes that we have to get out of burning fossil fuel as a source of power because not only climate change, but local air pollution. He's got a daughter who's asthmatic. He takes this very seriously, very personally. Number 2, I think he believes he's president of the United States today because of the difficult Iraq situation, and he is convinced that the American public is not interested in engagement in the Middle East in the kind of way we've had to be over the last several decades, because it's a very hard place for the U.S. to manage. But as long as energy supply lines run through the Middle East, we're going to have some tough times. And even if we were to get out of the Middle East, if we're dependent on imported oil, then we have another series of countries we have to deal with, like Russia, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Venezuela, which is almost a laundry list of troubled parts of the world that you really don't want the lifeblood of your economy flowing through. So the geostrategic logic for moving on from fossil fuels, very strong. And number 3, I think the president deeply believes that there is a green economy that lies ahead, an opportunity to really have one of the engines of our economic recovery be around clean energy and around energy efficiency. And I think the flow of capital into innovation in that space is therefore very important to him. So the good news is we're on a different track and a different trajectory today. The bad news is that this is not an easy issue to move through our political process. Everyone here knows that in the United States government, in our Congress in particular, it's a lot easier to block things than to advance things. And I think that is proving to be true not just on healthcare, but on an energy fix and a climate change strategy as well. And I think credit Congressman Waxman and Markey for having put a piece of legislation together. They've gotten the ball rolling, and I think that's very, very important. But there are elements of that legislative package that I think don't provide the pathway forward that we probably need and want. Number 1, it misses what I think is the most fundamental driver of a changed energy future potential of the last several years, and that's the emergence of natural gas as the best bridge fuel to an alternative energy future. If we switch from burning coal to burning gas, we can bring down emissions by about half, and gas today is much more plentiful than we understood it to be a couple of years ago, and at much lower prices with the promise of price stability going forward. And I think the cap and trade program, again, has a positive to it. It puts a price on carbon dioxide. It gets people thinking about how to be more efficient. It incentivizes alternative energy development. But again, there's a missed opportunity here. The way the auction permits have been handed out provides a whole lot of permits to fairly undeserving elements of our country. And we're squandering, I think, a big opportunity to use those revenues, $600 billion of which have been now allocated to various special interests. We could have used it to put a big down payment on a reformed healthcare program, or to lower taxes broadly so the American public would feel themselves positively rewarded by having us step up to this tough issue of climate change. And I think more fundamentally, we've missed the chance to really create an incentive structure to motivate a whole sweep of investments in clean energy. The goal I'd like to see is putting all of the alternatives for the future in the starting gate and run a race. We're going to use gas for the next 10 or 15 years, but let's run a race between wind and solar and some of the more exotic potential sources of energy, wave power, tidal power, second-generation biofuels, nuclear power if it can solve the economic issues and some of the waste and safety issues. And of course, let's put fossil fuels right there in the starting gates too, with the technical challenge being carbon capture and storage. And my view is 10 or 15-year race in the marketplace to figure out who can bring down their cost curves. We'll have a much better picture a decade from now, 15 years from now, about which of those options are the way forward. So I think the good news is we're stepping up to the issues. The bad news is we haven't really crafted the right incentive structure to get this technology incentive structure in place to really develop the alternatives we need.
Thank you, Dan. Let's move right on to Robert.
As a regulator in New York State, our job is to deliver safe and reliable service to all of you Con Ed customers out there at just and reasonable rates. We're on the retail end of the delivery chain. We've separated generation in New York from distribution. We sit at the intersection of policy and politics on the most granular level. And I have to pick up on something that Dan said about incentives. I'm old enough to have lived through the Arab oil embargo in the mid-'70s, and after that got involved in refuse to energy, primarily because of the tax benefits involved were very attractive to my employer. I was general counsel of a company here in New York. And in those days, the tax benefits were pretty significant. They were 15% investment tax credit and close to 25% accelerated depreciation. And the incentives today, just to bring you fast forward 25 or 30 years, are double that from the federal level alone. There were no incentives in New York State way back then. And today, New York State, through the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which we charge New Yorkers' bills, the money is administered by another state authority, provides some fairly significant incentives. Most of that money has gone to wind up in upstate New York. I don't come from an energy background. I don't have preconceived notions. I'm essentially a corporate transactional lawyer who ended up in this space by mistake, and I try to make the best of it whenever I can. So I look at something like wind, which I have great aspirations for, but the reality is that it's basically reliable 15% of the time. So if you're going to introduce new wind to fulfill a need for electricity demand, you basically have to build Dan's gas-fired turbines side by side because you can only count on it being available 15% of the time. And gee, what if you really need to have the lights on while that system's down? Last summer, there was a bit of a misunderstanding in Texas, and all the wind in West Texas didn't make it to market for 3 weeks. And that was almost as funny as California sort of goofing up in the early 2000s on how they administered their policy. But all of this policy stuff is basically, I hate to say it, trial and error. We right now are looking at an awful lot of very significant schemes at the federal level, most of which are really good ideas to get into these starting gates. I agree with what Dan said about that. But we have to look at charging our customers in New York. And while most of the folks here are educated and affluent, a statistic that will really bring this down to earth. This time last year, that's at the end of the summer, you know, it's not the winter heating season, there were roughly $300 million of electric utility bills unpaid for 60 days. That's a lot of money. That's at the beginning of this crunch. So a year later, post-Lehman, it's $600 million, double that amount. So when we look at our expectation for what we can, how many straws we can load on the back of the consumer camel, it gets really difficult to see where the breaking point is, and often you see it in retrospect. You don't see it prospectively. It's a difficult thing to envision. So what we try to do in the expectation and reality is to provide significant incentives in New York State for new approaches to energy. Those of you who live here, you're paying for it unless you live on Long Island because, oh, I should go into that just for a second. You should know that Con Ed supplies power in New York City and Westchester County. You should know that the largest transmission company in the United Kingdom, National Grid, supplies it to Buffalo and other places up in that direction. And as you get more towards the center of the state, the second largest transmission company in the UK and one of the largest utilities in Spain, Iberdrola, supplies the delivery of electricity there. And then you should also consider that the New York Power Authority, which basically controls all the hydroelectric production in the state, which is very significant, it's almost 20% of the electrical usage in the state, we have no jurisdiction over them. They're an independent power center and a power authority. And of course on Long Island, the site of the Shoreham debacle, and if any of you live on Long Island, you're still paying for the $6 billion that Shoreham cost because somebody goofed along the way. That's run by the Long Island Power Authority. Again, we have no jurisdiction over them, and neither the customers of the New York Power Authority nor the Long Island Power Authority contribute to the incentives that we have. So one of my aspirations, and I won't get into the reality, I think I just touched on the reality. One of my aspirations is we actually get a coordinated energy policy here in New York State to complement what's being done at the federal level. Our most recently added commissioner was Governor Currey's first energy office manager back in the 80s. And he has on his desk The first report done in the state, there were 10 major recommendations. Unfortunately, 9 of them are still valid. Only one's been taken care of. So my aspiration is we actually get our act together. I hate to say the reality is we're still not there. Taking some of John's ideas long term, we may get there.
Thank you. And now over to Yuri.
I'm a professor, and I should probably talk more about aspirations here. But I'm also an engineer, and I operate with numbers and facts. And I think many mistakes made in the past are due to the fact that numbers have been rarely used to evaluate the situation, even less frequently compared. And if you want to get a big picture, if you want to go from aspirations to reality, the only way to do it is to compare numbers. I'm not going to get you bored with the numbers, and there is no blackboard here, and I was not allowed by John to bring my computer and show slides. So what I will try to do is to just give you a big picture that emerges from analysis of the numbers. Because what is important is to ask right questions. And there are a lot of people who argue what is better and cheaper, wind or nuclear. But if you ask a question like that, you need to ask a question, how much wind can we harvest? What percentage of our national needs can it cover and where? And if you're in favor of nuclear, how much uranium we have? And what will be the cost of uranium, say 20 years down the road? Because this is when you probably will recover your investment made into building new power stations now. And with these questions, if you compare all the sources, you will be able to estimate whether we can really cover all our needs using renewable resources and not sacrificing quality of life. And basically, the analysis done by a number of people around the world shows that in this country, if we decrease consumption of energy to the average European level, and much of this can probably be done not by, for example, driving slower cars and cars that can accelerate good enough, but using supercapacitor batteries to accelerate cars well, that you can have a small engine car or electric car, but you can still accelerate like you're in a Porsche. By insulating our houses and using emission low glasses to prevent heat in the environment. So we need to save energy, we need to decrease the consumption, and then potentially renewables can cover all our energy needs. However, let's get back to reality. It's not going to happen overnight. And if we start building tomorrow solar batteries in Arizona and Nevada in the hopes that a few years down the road, we will completely cover all our needs just because there is enough sun energy to do it, it won't work. What will really work, as already a couple of people on this panel mentioned, is a mixture of various sources and a gradual transition. What is important to do to understand how much each of these sources of energy, renewable and sustainable sources of energy, can contribute. And a good example was raised by previously ethanol from corn program. If you do simple back of the envelope calculation, you see that from a square foot or square mile of land, you can get 100 times roughly more energy by harvesting wind energy, and close to 1,000 times more if you use solar energy. And this immediately shows to you that even in the best case scenario, if we use all land available to us, and actually this is a much more valuable land that is used to grow corn, the contribution of biofuel will probably be very small at the noise level, and if we want to use it, we probably need to use waste bio or some biomass developed from ponds and sea rather than corn. And clearly wind and solar will be much higher on the priority list. They can cover tens of % of our energy needs in the future. However, it's also important to remember that we don't get that much sunshine somewhere in Massachusetts and much more in Arizona or Nevada. And wind blows stronger in Texas. But delivering this energy to Massachusetts or Oregon may be difficult, expensive, and the grid will not be able to handle it. So we need to diversify. There are many sources of renewable energy: wind, solar, biomass, tidal, geothermal, hydrothermal, salinity mix, you name it. And locally, many of them can and must be used. And what I believe will be happening is large also diversification and decentralization of the energy landscape. If we diversify it, what will also happen, healthy competition between different energy sources will push the prices down, and at the end of the day, the ones that can provide less expensive, sustainable green energy at a lower cost will survive, will lead, will take a larger portion, and Texas, California, and Pennsylvania, where I'm coming from, may use different contributions of this energy here. Couple of other things before I finish. What I think is happening, inevitably happening, we are moving from the chemical universe to physical, electrical energy universe, whether we want or not, whether we use solar or wind or nuclear power. What it practically means that we need to change a lot of things in the infrastructure. I personally don't believe you can fix the grid to such an extent that it will satisfy ever-growing demand. You can only decentralize. You need to have independent power sources for all our cell phones, computers, and millions of other gadgets. We also need to contribute a lot in development of much better electrical energy storage solutions, from battery supercapacitor to flywheels and others. Otherwise, it will quickly become a bottleneck in the future developments here. And I personally believe that nuclear energy may become an important contributor, and probably there is no other main source of energy for us for the next decade or two before we can build huge solar and wind farms, and also actually move technology, photovoltaic and other technology, far enough to make it economically competitive here. So nuclear will probably stay. What will be the percentage? I'm not sure, but I personally believe it will be 1/3, 20%, 50%. I don't know. If we ever learn to make artificial suns run nuclear fusion from hydrogen on the Earth, we may solve all our problems by using nuclear energy, but scientists estimate that we are at least 30 years away from this technology here. So to summarize what I said, I believe what we need to do is diversify energy sources, move to renewable and sustainable energy sources, and we need innovate, because all this technology are at a relatively earlier stage yet. And if this country does it, it will remain leader in the world in technology, and also will remain a leading economy. If not, we will be depending 10, 20 years down the road on foreign electricity, foreign energy technology. In a similar way, we are depending now on Saudi oil or other energy resources from abroad, and I'm going to stop at that point.
Thank you, Yuri. David?
Great. First, let me apologize, folks. I've just developed a cold in about the last 24 hours, so I'm having a little trouble speaking, and I clear my throat frequently. Forgive me for that. But Yuri, thank you for kind of the lead-in. You know, Yuri mentioned he believes we're moving from the physical into an electrical energy world, and I agree with him on that. And I am really going to talk from the perspective of the electrical industry, because that's where I come from primarily. And to do that, and to kind of talk about where we are today and what the aspiration, I think, needs to be, I need to kind of talk a little bit about history. Because if you look back in the late 19th century, early 20th century, really throughout the 20th century, society's assignment to the electric utilities was to electrify the country, was to get electricity out and available to everyone, to improve the standard of living and the quality of life, and to do that as cheaply as possible. It's very much the same assignment that is going on in China today, for example. They're just now electrifying the country. So the business model, the fundamental business model that was put in place back really at the beginning of the 20th century to support that kind of an assignment was a volumetric business model. And the way the utilities got to make money, the way the electric utilities got to make money, was they invested money in assets, invested capital in assets that would provide electricity, and they were allowed to earn a return on and of that investment based on the volume of electricity they sold. So the built-in incentive is to sell ever-increasing volumes of electricity. Wonderful business model if your objective is to electrify a country that's not yet electrified and to do it in a low-cost way. Wonderful. In the 21st century, though, my contention is that is no longer society's assignment to the electric utilities. People still want reliable and affordable electricity, but in my opinion, they also want energy efficiency, they want low carbon, and really, when we think it through as a society, we're going to want our country to be the most energy efficient in the world, because that's the way we're going to compete as we manufacture products, as we compete in the global marketplace. We will need to be the most energy efficient. Think about it for a minute. A volumetric, sell more and more electricity to make more money kind of business model is not supportive of that kind of assignment. So where some of my fellow panelists talked about tax incentives and allocations, what I want to suggest to you is that the real revolution in energy, especially on the electric front, and I think it extends to other forms of energy as well, is to fundamentally change the business model. It's no longer going to work to incent people, to earn money by selling more and more of something that has the kinds of externalities that our energy consumption has. Instead, we're going to need to create business models probably more similar to telecommunications business models, for example, that really allow us as consumers to decide what trade-offs we want to make between comfort, convenience, cost, and environmental footprint. And we're going to need, I think, to provide product offerings and services that conform with those kinds of consumer constraints that do, in fact, balance comfort, convenience, environmental footprint, and cost. I mean, if you think about it, when was the last time you made a phone call and paid cents per minute for your phone call? I don't know if anybody in the room remembers doing that. I do, because I'm old enough to do it, but not what you do today. You buy a package that best suits your needs at the economics that best suit your needs. And I think until we fundamentally change that business model, we're going to truly struggle to square the circle on energy efficiency and low carbon in this country. So I'll stop there. Happy clearly to answer any questions.
Okay. Let me check first to see if any of the panelists have questions of any of the other panelists.
I just have a comment following on the concept just articulated. There is, and your eyes can start to glaze over right now, a concept called decoupling, which essentially says that we break the business model. We adopted this, by the way, in New York State at my instance 2 years ago. We haven't done anything with it, but we adopted it. So reality and aspiration, my aspiration is we'd really get into it. The reality is nobody really wants to do it because they're afraid of what might happen. So what you do is you basically say, if you deliver the service to the door, Con Edison, you get X dollars. It's up to the customer to decide, how much they're going to pay for the package of electricity or the 600 minutes on their cell phone. And if you have teenage daughters, 600 minutes, of course, doesn't work. But you try to work out what that is. That's one point I'd like to add. Another is, I was fortunate this summer to have a couple of really bright interns from the Columbia Earth Institute, and I had them survey all the surveys that were done of voters, non-voters, Americans, who was around, who had an expression of opinion on energy resources, conservation of resources, renewable resources. And as the economy got worse, the interest level diminished apace. So one of the things you're always concerned about in sex, politics, and accounting is timing. And our timing might not be just right now for some of the really positive, broad initiatives that have been afforded us by the Obama vision of how things should be. So I keep an eye on Pew, on Harris, on all the polls to see where people are in this, and there's a diminishing level of enthusiasm.
Dan?
So I just would add to Bob's point, I think the key here is actually going to be private sector innovation and getting a structure of incentives that engage the companies in rethinking the business model, in driving the technology development process. And by the way, we're talking a lot about alternative energy. It's also, as has been pointed out, the sort of infrastructure around that It's the transmission system. It's the batteries. It's the storage. And I think we need a lot of entrepreneurial talent, a lot of creative energy put into this. And the real key should be, how do we get these guys who are in the position to really make it happen incentivized to do so? And this is where this guy probably should step up. He tells me he's got 4 other commissioners who drag him down. But
that's it. That's the story, and I'm sticking to it.
I think that's not good enough. It is going to take, I think, a much greater strategic vision. And it does seem to me, Amory Lovins, the great energy guru, likes to say, Americans don't really want refrigerators or hot water heaters. They want cold beer and hot showers. And so rather than making these guys charged by the kilowatt they flow into the refrigerator or the hot water heater, how about paying them to keep the beer cold and the showers hot? And however they can do it. I think that's what it's going to take, because the average person's not going to be able to solve this problem or even figure out who to go to solve it. The average person is overwhelmed by not having information about the choices they should make. There's a lot of inertia. People would like to do the right thing, but they're willing to give it about 12 seconds a week in figuring this out. Some surveys show as little as 2 seconds. And there is a capital problem. The average person doesn't have the money to buy the high efficiency this or that. So I think we have to shift the business model, let the utilities own the stuff, and charge a rental fee or something that shifts the model so we get this creative spirit moving in the direction we need to.
Let me ask a really fundamental question, if I may, for comments. My thesis for this discussion is that we can imagine all kinds of future possibilities. We've heard reference to many future possibilities. The reality of today's electricity supply is that, or let me just talk about the reality of today's energy supply, not just electricity, energy supply. 93% of the nation's energy today comes from a combination of fossil fuels and nuclear. 5% comes from hydropower, roughly 2% from renewables. In the electrical industry, of some 600 coal-fired plants, the average age is over 35 years. And in the last 5 years, the nation has blocked or shelved 100 new coal plants. In the nuclear realm, 104 nuclear plants, about half of them are getting, within the next 10 years, very close to the end of their commissioned life cycle. While we are talking about wind and solar and biofuels, and I might point out that in the oil patch in this country, where we used to produce 10 million barrels a day, we're down close to 6 million barrels per day, and we can see our way to 5, just with natural decline and the fact that the government has prohibited the opening up of new access to 85% of the Outer Continental Shelf and federal lands. So my thesis is we might run out of energy before we have the opportunity to institute new systems. With aging coal plants, which will go down faster because of carbon management rules, which make them too expensive to operate, with running out of domestic oil production before biofuels or plug-in hybrids have an impact, or the nuclear plants start to come offline and can't be replaced one for one with wind farms or solar farms. So I asked the panel, what do you think about the fact that we might just run out of energy while we're on our way to a new energy platform?
Well, I guess that's exactly the reason why it's necessary to start today. And it's possible to build a significant number of nuclear power plants, but it will take time and it will take money. However, a lot of energy can be saved today. We waste a lot. Just give you an example. US has the largest consumption per capita in the world among developed countries and the largest CO2 production. With about the same level of GDP, in European country consume about 40% less probably. Hong Kong consumes about 1/3 of what US consumes per person. So there is plenty of room to decrease energy consumption by eliminating incandescent bulbs, for example. This is what Japan has already made starting this year or last year?
Last year.
Last year, I believe here. Most of European countries introducing too. It's also economically viable because you won't need to replace bulbs very often here. So I think what is important to start now. But my question in return to you both here, I don't envision this happening by purely economical incentives to industry. I think it probably won't be possible to do without interference of the government. Give you a simple example. Working at Drexel University, I can get $110 in pre-tax dollars to pay for my public transportation. And I can take more than $300 if I drive a car and park it in Philadelphia. So what kind of incentive do I get? To take a train which consumes 10 times less energy per trip compared to car, or a bus where you have 1/3 of energy compared to driving a car or drive a car. Well, I still do take a train, but most people don't. And this is what makes a difference here. So I'm wondering, what is the role of government?
So let me just answer that, because I said it really is critical to engage the private sector. It doesn't mean government goes away. Quite to the contrary, I think it means government has to be all the smarter about the incentive structure it puts in place. And the incentive you described is a great example of one that's upside down, where we are doing the wrong thing. And frankly, I think one of the things we need to recognize is that the model of subsidies, subsidizing good behavior, is not as good as penalizing bad behavior. So what we really need is to get people to pay for the harms they cause, particularly starting with the greenhouse gas emissions harms. And if we have that as a broad-based price to be paid, then we start to steer people to do the right things. And again, I fear that we are not on that track in terms of policy in Washington today. It's a lot easier as a politician to pay people for doing good deeds than to put a penalty in for bad deeds. But I think until we get to the price to be paid for the harm, our incentive structure really won't engage every citizen in the way we need to, and won't fully engage the business community in searching out solutions.
You know, I really agree with you, but I think there's another piece, and that piece is we, and in this case, I think both government and private industry, have to provide the right level of information and governance to people for the right decisions to be made. And what I mean by that is, you know, a lot of people, you talk about, you know, punishing the bad, and I agree with you, by the way. But a lot of people think, well, the bad thing is the power plant making the CO2 over there. Well, the power plant doesn't run and make the CO2 unless you turn something on that makes the power plant run and create the CO2. But you have no information to tell you what your actions are creating. So today when we at Duke, for example, here's how we treat our customers, and it's almost criminal, but the fact of the matter is we can't do it any differently because of the way the system's constructed. Today once a month we send people a bill that tells them how much they owe us for what they spent last month. There's no detail. It's just as though you went to a grocery store, filled your cart with all kinds of stuff, you know, caviar and champagne and pork rinds and beer or whatever it is you like, and you go to the cash register, and the person at the register weighs your cart and then calculates a bill for you based on the average price of every single item in the store, and sends you a one-line bill the next month, a month later, that says you owe us X dollars for groceries. That's what we do. And we don't do it because we're scoundrels, even though you may think we're scoundrels, but we do it because we don't have any better information. So as we build out the systems that provide that kind of information, that I think is when we're really going to be able to give people the choices and give government.
But don't we have a capacity in this information age to do better? You know, the thing I've always wanted from my utility was not how much I spent on energy last month, and because I live in a very sufficiently well-regulated state, I'm told how much I used this month last year, so that I get some point of comparison, but it's actually not the relevant comparison. What I would like to know is what other 3,500 square foot houses in central Connecticut with 2 children and a wife, as well as a husband running around, are generating and consuming. I have a secret fear that I'm next to Al Gore at the very high energy spend of the equation. I think I'm a good citizen and trying to do the right thing, but I actually have no idea.
Let me throw something in anecdotally now that applies to this. Peer pressure, which is what Dan was alluding to, has been used successfully in experiments, principally in California, principally with municipally owned electric, but also with some utilities in Southern California, so that you get your printout that says this is what you spent. Now, the average in your neighborhood was a little bit less or a little bit more, and the really, really efficient people in your neighborhood were way down here. Now, don't you feel really, it doesn't say don't you feel really stupid, but the implication is don't you feel really stupid that you are so far more profligate than these folks who are really conserving. Now, it sounds absurd, but the cost is minimal to do this. It's like $10 per customer per year, and there have been fairly significant savings affected by nudging people.
So Bob, one further thought when you get ready to mandate this. Don't just tell me what the best 10% did, but tell me what they do differently from what I do.
That's
you know,
key.
they close their windows, or they take the air conditioning off and open the windows. I wish I knew what are the 10 simple steps that the smartest folks are doing that I'm missing.
Check
Well,
our
that's-
website, excuse me.
And that's the key, but there again, we can't really get there definitively until we've got better systems and better information. There's a coffee pot on the market right now. It costs $11 a month on our system where the residential cost of electricity is about 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour. It costs $11 a month to plug in if you don't even make any coffee. Why is that? It's because people want their coffee ready 2 minutes after they push the button instead of 7 minutes after they push the button. How many people do you think know that coffee maker is costing them $11 a month? And how many of them do you think would rip it out and buy something else if they knew? So that's the kind of, I think we have to get to that finer level of detail.
Although I think the price signal helps motivate people. I've lived in France, and everyone's dishwashers are set on a timer to run in the night when the rates are lower.
And water heaters.
And the water heaters as
And
well.
other things.
So it seems to me there's a whole set of steps that if we got the price signals right and the information right, we could move toward.
Okay. We want to make sure the audience participants have a chance to speak or ask questions. So please, if you do have something you would like to ask or say, please simply step up to a microphone. Okay. Okay. Mary?
You mentioned that something that is negative has more impact than a positive. But when you've got a Congress that is getting positive money from various people, how do you get them to act in a negative way?
This is a very big challenge. I think there's an ugly secret about our Congress, and that is they're not very good at legislating. It's a bit of an awkwardness that the legislature is not good at legislating. But I think one of the errors of the Obama administration has been to turn over important issues for congressional leadership. And I think you then get a product that is dominated by special and regional interests, as opposed to someone with a broad national interest and a vision to the future. So I'm actually eager to see more leadership from the White House. I think it's true in healthcare. I think it could have been true on the stimulus package, and I think it will be true on energy and climate change. And fundamentally, I think you've got to have that strong leadership from the president to corral a Congress that by design represents all kinds of different interests, including special interests.
Let's go to the back, then we'll come to the front and to the back.
We hear a lot about renewables, but how realistic is it, for example, for renewable energy like wind power and solar power to supply the energy needs of Manhattan, particularly in this era where we have people, whenever a new gadget comes out, whether they're cell phones or Blackberries or iPods, everybody wants to have one. Everybody has to have the latest one. And it seems that people seem to want more energy-consuming products now than they ever have.
It's a tough question to answer because our regulatory scope doesn't extend to what you know, how many TV sets you have in your house that have cable-ready boxes that turn on like that. There is, however, a plan afoot right now to consider building a wind farm on the outer continental shelf outside of New York Harbor. The companion pieces are in Rhode Island and off of Jersey, near Atlantic City. It might be a good time to try something like that, but again, you have to balance off a whole host of ingredients, including the fact that you've got a regulatory scheme that doesn't accommodate these new approaches to things. But it's tough to mandate the kind of concerns that you just articulated. One thing that I think of, because my wife is wheelchair bound, I think of the effect of the Americans with Disability Act and the mandate that if you want federal funds to do anything in the construction world, you have to accommodate people who have wheelchair needs. Now, I went to Albany and went to the State Dormitory Authority and said, listen, how about you mandate that anyone who borrows money from you guys has a really energy efficient building? And they said, HARS, we don't do that. We work on incentives. And I said, why don't you work on disincentive? We don't do it that way here. So one of my aspirations is we change that.
Okay, front.
Hello. I'd like to ask a question based on numbers. According to T. Boone Pickens, we're sending $700 billion to the Arabs every year. Now, I realize that depends upon the price of oil and the barrels consumed. If we cut that consumption by 10%, you're talking $70 billion. Does it cost $5 billion to build a new nuclear plant? We could build 14 nuclear...
10.
All right, 10. Even 10, we would get 7 new nuclear plants a year, put people to work, reduce the money we're sending to the Arabs, and we could get that from the TARP money. Everybody else got money. Is there anything wrong with those numbers?
Nope. Well, Pickens is heavy.
Pickens' number is exaggerated.
They're quite exaggerated, yeah. But other than that,
I
it's
think
the right
when-
idea.
Is it within the realm of possibility?
It's not
We-
probability.
We did send about $500 billion in crude oil export prices outside the U.S. over the course of, say, 2005 to 2008. That's $500 billion that went out of Americans' pockets, and we still prohibited the production of domestic crude oil. So that is a different argument than what you're making about shifting the money to nuclear. I think from my point of view, what's missing is the grand plan. There has not been a grand plan in this country that takes into account the supply side and demand side, that looks out for the interests of the country. We tend to focus on the interest of individuals, consumers, the people with the loudest voices, the NIMBY crowd, whatever it may be, and the nation is facing an affordability crisis and an availability crisis in the coming years. Let's move to the back.
Yeah. In favor of grand plans. I ask this as a question, not because I think I know the answer, but I'm concerned that there seems to be at least a vague consensus on the panel that it's necessary to move move towards more nuclear and non-conventional carbon in order to bridge towards the renewable future. And I'm a little concerned about, in the absence of planning, to talk about, as a couple of panelists put forward, to let 1,000 energy sources bloom and to level the playing field, let them fight it out. Because although that seems reasonable, it's the competitive way. By doing so, in the absence of planning, you may actually be foreclosing other options. And in particular, I certainly agree with Professor Esty that you have to fully price the negative externalities of the energy sources. But there's more than that, because there's the issue of time scale and time horizon. I don't know the answer on this, but because the renewable energy sources are essentially things like concentrated solar power are essentially a front-end cost, and then they're free after you pay that off. It looks more attractive the longer the time horizon. That's clear.
Okay, and your question, please?
The question is, are we really considering seriously, and I don't see it, frankly, on this panel, I haven't seen it addressed, seriously the potential for concentrating more on renewable energy instead of the carbon nuclear bridge that is being put forward here?
Comments?
Well, since I talked a lot about renewables, let me take this question here. I think, and I'm sorry if I didn't make it clear, I think this is what needs to be done. What is important is that we cannot replace oil, coal, and nuclear with renewables tomorrow. And probably we won't be able to replace it in 5 or 10 years. So what is important is to move towards renewable. More energy from solar, from wind, from other sources, but at the same time also have an alternative, because otherwise, as John mentioned, we may run out of energy, run out of gas before we have renewable economy built. And very scientific estimate done by a number of independent experts shows that we can cover a very large part of our energy needs with renewable. But again, we need incentives from the government.
Okay.
We need to save.
We have 5 minutes left. We want to get as many of you as we can. So let's go to the front.
I would like to also take a world picture and take up your point that there need to be multiple solutions. I would like to propose a solution that could save 20% of the use of low-grade carbon, fossil and other low-grade fuels, and that is direct solar. For 1.4 billion people on Earth, which is almost 20% of the population of the world, we could introduce direct solar, which could replace for the average family 75% of their use of fuels. Some of the other benefits are it reduces black carbon, which is the second worst contaminant of the atmosphere. It reduces lung disease and eye disease, the biggest killer for women and children in the developing world. It reduces desertification because of the cutting of trees and grasses. It provides safety for women and children who have to spend 6 hours on the average gathering fuel and exposing them to rape and capture.
Ma'am, is there a
2
question?
more points.
Okay, quickly.
Okay. And it provides economic independence as well as pure water. So my question is, why is something like this, which is so obvious and simple, not being promoted? Because it seems to me the problem is only the profit motive.
We're out of time, so I think, let me just take this one. This is being done by many sustainable development types of organizations in the developing world. I think we're in a country where we have ubiquitous electricity supply. It doesn't help this U.S. We're really focused on U.S. today, but I think you make a good point for the world. Thank you. Move to the back.
Thank you. I thought it was really funny the allusion to the fact that Americans don't want a refrigerator and a water heater, but they want cold beer and a hot shower. I wonder how that would apply to cars if we push that. People want cars or they want transportation. I think we haven't talked much about cars, but the fact that cars are individual power generators, if we move to, say, electrical cars, the problem still remains the same, is that power needs to be generated for those cars. And I'd like to hear your opinions on
Thoughts
this.
on personal mobility?
Well, cars can potentially use much less energy. And electric cars are already there, more and more companies switching. Prius has become now the most sold vehicle even in Japan for Toyota here. So I think this is where we are going. So there will be less gas consuming, but we need also public transportation system in this country much better developed, because I already mentioned buses and trains require much less energy. And I think, again, this is the way to go, but incentives are needed. If it becomes less expensive and trains, buses will be available, people will start taking public transportation.
Can you do 30 seconds?
30 seconds. What do you expect? You talked about aspirations and reality. Copenhagen could be a big disappointment. And from the standpoint of U.S. leadership, when it comes to cap and trade or solar or capture and storage, we have lost that role of leadership, and that will threaten our global economic future altogether.
30-second response.
As a former negotiator and one of the people when I was at the EPA put the 1992 Framework Convention together, the only treaty the U.S. has ever signed up to, I think it's critical to have U.S. leadership. And I think without a legislative package in the United States having been approved, it's almost impossible for us to exercise that leadership. So it's important to recognize that the domestic political conversation in Washington and the international negotiations have to proceed not just in tandem, or not just in parallel, but in tandem. They are deeply intertwined. And I think it's going to be critical to have signals coming out of the international negotiation that reassures the Congress that if they step up, others will too. But at the same moment, the U.S. has to provide a signal if it's going to get the Indias and the Chinas to move forward. And I think we're actually quite far away at this point.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm very sorry we could go on for another hour, I'm sure. But thanks to the panel. Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you.
Enjoyed talking
Thank
with
you. Great leadership, John. Thank you. Okay, sure.